December 25th, 1941, at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. 3 weeks after the attack, rain hammers the burned-out piers and the twisted warships along Battleship Row. A Navy flying boat drops through the clouds and skims in over water still streaked with oil and wreckage. At one of the windows, Admiral Chester Nimitz looks down at what is left of the Pacific Fleet. The battleship Arizona is a shattered tomb. Oklahoma lies on her side. Other giants like West Virginia, California, and Nevada sit half-sunken or beached in the mud. This is the moment Nimitz is told that this wrecked harbor and this damaged navy are now his to lead. On paper, he has 3 working carriers and a small group of codebreakers. Facing him is an empire that has just swept across the Pacific almost at will. Yet less than 4 years later, that same officer will stand on the deck of an American battleship in Tokyo Bay while Japan signs its surrender. In this video, we are going to see how Chester Nimitz led the United States Navy from ruin at Pearl Harbor to victory in Tokyo Bay, and why he was willing to stake the Pacific War on a handful of ships and a code-breaking gamble. Nimitz was not an obvious choice for this moment. When Franklin Roosevelt looked at the wrecked Pacific Fleet, he had many admirals who outranked Nimitz in years of service, yet he reached past them and selected a submariner who was working in Washington. Later, accounts describe Roosevelt telling Nimitz in very blunt terms to get out to Pearl Harbor and stay there until the war was won. By December 31st, 1941, when the flying boat set down in the harbor, Nimitz was already wearing 4 stars and carrying the title Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet. He stepped out into the holiday rain and took in a scene of capsized, burned, and sunken battleships, with salvage crews working pumps and cutting torches around twisted superstructures, smoke still seeping from open hatches, and a heavy smell of fuel and burned paint. On New Year's Eve, the traditional battleship deck change of command could not happen because every battleship at Pearl Harbor had been sunk or damaged, so Nimitz formally relieved his predecessor, Husband Kimmel, on the deck of the submarine USS Grayling at the submarine base. For a man whose career had been built in submarines, the setting was fitting, and later writers have treated that ceremony as a quiet sign that the center of naval power was shifting from battleships toward carriers and submarines that lay beyond the horizon or below the surface. What he saw on the map was just as stark. Japan's navy had more carriers, more battleships, more cruisers, more destroyers, and more submarines. Its pilots had spent years training for war. Its carrier force had just crossed the Pacific, attacked Pearl Harbor, and withdrawn without losing a ship. By the time Nimitz raised his flag, the Philippines were under assault. Guam had fallen, Wake Island's small garrison had fought off an initial attack and then been overwhelmed, and places like Singapore and the Dutch East Indies were clearly in danger. On paper, the United States still had greater industry and manpower, but in the first months after Pearl Harbor, Nimitz could really count in the Pacific on 3 big carriers: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, while Yorktown was still finishing her shift from the Atlantic. The battleship line was out of action. Cruisers and destroyers were scarce, and airfields across the Western Pacific were being captured by Japanese forces. The cautious course would have been to pull back, protect what remained, and wait for new carriers from American shipyards and reinforcements from the Atlantic before taking major risks. But biographers describe Nimitz as regarding that apparently safe option as the most dangerous choice he could make. He started by working on the people around him. When he met Kimmel's staff in a low building near the submarine base, contemporaries recalled that many officers feared they were about to be sent home in disgrace. Instead, Nimitz told them that anyone who wanted a transfer could have one, but that he hoped most would stay, and most did. Intelligence officer Edwin Layton stayed. War Plans Officer Charles McMorris stayed, and the officers who had just lived through Pearl Harbor began helping to plan the response. Nimitz also leaned heavily on another, quieter resource, the cryptanalysts of Station Hypo. In an ordinary-looking building at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of linguists and codebreakers were attacking the main Japanese naval operational code, known to the Americans as JN-25. They were not reading every message in clear text. They were rebuilding codebooks from fragments, combining partial decrypts and filling gaps with professional judgment. In Washington, senior officers in the Navy Communications Intelligence Branch were often wary of Rochefort and thought some of his conclusions about Japanese plans pushed ahead of what the raw evidence alone could guarantee. Nimitz listened to Leighton, who trusted Rochefort. Years earlier, the two men had studied in Japan, and they knew the language, the culture, and the habits of the Imperial Navy. When Rochefort's assessments clashed with more cautious views coming from Washington, Nimitz increasingly backed the team in the hot, windowless rooms at Pearl Harbor over the officers behind desks on the Potomac. And later histories of the war argue that this habit of trust became crucial. The early months of 1942 showed how narrow his margin was. Carriers under his authority carried out fast raids into the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, hitting Japanese bases. Historians tend to see those strikes as both a signal that the Pacific Fleet was still in the fight and a way to develop carrier tactics under combat pressure. In April, Nimitz approved the plan to load Army B-25 bombers onto the carrier Hornet and send them to hit targets in Japan, an operation remembered as the Doolittle Raid. The raid caused limited physical damage, but Japanese records and later studies agree that it shocked planners in Tokyo and strengthened the view inside the Imperial Navy that American carriers would have to be drawn into a major battle and destroyed. That search for a showdown helped guide them toward a small atoll about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii Midway. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team was seeing more and more Japanese traffic about an operation against a target labeled AF. Analysts in Washington thought the next major strike might land on Port Moresby in New Guinea, somewhere in the South Pacific, or even the Aleutians. But Rochefort became convinced that AF was the Japanese designator for Midway, the westernmost American base in the Central Pacific. The trouble for Nimitz was that he needed more than conviction. He was about to move the three fleet carriers he still had available into the path of what he believed was the main Japanese carrier-striking force. If Rochefort was wrong about Midway, those ships could be lost for no gain. The codebreakers at Hypo put forward a test. Midway's garrison was instructed over secure channels to send an unencrypted radio message saying that its water distillation plant had broken down and that the island was short of fresh water. The garrison sent that message in plain language in the knowledge that Japanese listening posts monitored American traffic. Within about a day, Hypo intercepted a Japanese encrypted message that reported AF was short of water. For Rochefort and his team, that was the confirmation they needed that AF meant Midway. Even then, they were not reading every Japanese signal in full. Some messages yielded only a few groups of code. Others could not be broken in time, but in this case, the fragments fitted together well enough. The emerging picture showed 4 large carriers, the same quartet that had attacked Pearl Harbor, with a supporting force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, heading toward Midway in early June. Nimitz now had to contend with pressure from 2 directions. One was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force at sea. The other was in Washington, where some officers still believed the main Japanese blow might fall elsewhere and argued for holding his carriers back. Later accounts agree that Hypo's judgments at this stage were based on partial decrypts, but Nimitz had nothing better, and he chose to commit his 3 carriers on the assumption that Rochefort's reading was correct, and that the more cautious view in Washington was not. To meet that threat, he also needed ships that could fight. The carrier Yorktown had just returned from the Battle of the Coral Sea with damage that shipyard engineers at Pearl Harbor initially thought would require months of work. Nimitz told them they had 3 days. For roughly 72 hours, welders, electricians, carpenters, and riggers worked around the clock on the ship. They patched her flight deck, braced damaged bulkheads, bypassed wrecked systems, and brought her back to a state that officers later described as operational but not pretty. 3 days after limping into port, Yorktown sailed out again to join the other carriers. The command arrangements for the coming battle were sensitive. Nimitz first wanted his most aggressive carrier commander, William Halsey, widely known as Bull, to lead the operation. But Halsey was in hospital with a severe case of dermatitis after long service at sea. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz visited him, and Halsey pointed to his escort force commander, Raymond Spruance, a cruiser admiral who had never led carriers in combat, as the man he thought should take over that task group. Nimitz kept Frank Jack Fletcher in overall tactical command on board Yorktown and gave Spruance command of Enterprise and Hornet. The plan itself was straightforward. Japanese planners believed the American carriers were still far from Midway. Nimitz intended to move Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown to a position northeast of the atoll, so that they could strike Nagumo's carriers once his aircraft were committed against the island. On the charts, that position was marked with the code name Point Luck. On June 4th, 1942, Nagumo's first strike group launched from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu and flew toward Midway. Japanese aircraft hit hangars, fuel stores, and anti-aircraft positions. Marine and Army Air Forces units on the island fought back, but they were outnumbered, and by the end of the first phase, Midway's air strength had been badly reduced. Then reports from Japanese search. Aircraft began to come in. One scout plane reported sighting American ships, including a vessel that appeared to be a carrier, to the northeast. Nagumo now had to choose. Japanese naval doctrine had left some ambiguity about how to balance strikes against land bases and against enemy carriers, and historians note that this showed in his next decisions. He could send a second strike at Midway to be sure the base was neutralized, or he could recall aircraft, change their armament, and prepare to attack the newly reported carriers, which meant bringing planes back to the decks, refueling them, and changing bombs for torpedoes with fueled aircraft and loose ordnance on and below the flight decks. As he worked through those options, the American attacks started to arrive. They did not come as a single coordinated blow. First, land-based bombers from Midway attacked from high altitude and scored no hits. Then, the torpedo squadrons from the three American carriers went in at low level. The Douglas T-B-D Devastator was slow and poorly protected, and its torpedoes had a poor record. Japanese Zero fighters tore into the low-flying formations. Out of 41 Devastators that took off that morning, only 6 returned, and not one torpedo struck a Japanese ship. For the men in those squadrons, it was a massacre, but for the battle, it forced the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, where they were busy chasing the torpedo planes while anti-aircraft fire filled the lower sky. Above that, briefly unchallenged, 2 groups of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown reached the Japanese fleet after a series of navigation errors and course changes that pilots later described as almost accidental. When they broke through the clouds, they suddenly saw carriers below them, with their decks crowded and their fighters out of position. In the next few minutes, the balance of the Pacific War shifted. The dive bombers went into steep attacks, releasing bombs that crashed through hangar decks where fueled aircraft and stored ordnance were present. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu each received hits that proved fatal. Within a short time, they were burning extensively, their flight decks wrecked. Only Hiryu, which was operating some distance away, escaped the first attack. Hiryu then launched her own counterstrikes. Her air crews found Yorktown, already damaged at Coral Sea and only just repaired at Pearl Harbor. Bombs and torpedoes hit the carrier hard. Yorktown was left badly crippled and was later abandoned, but her use as a target absorbed blows that might otherwise have gone elsewhere. Later that day, dive bombers from Enterprise located Hiryu and set her on fire. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers that had taken part in the Pearl Harbor attack were either sinking or no longer operational. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, roughly 240 aircraft, and more than 3,000 personnel. The United States lost Yorktown, 1 destroyer, about 150 aircraft, and a little over 300 personnel. In strategic terms, those losses were not equal. Japan could not easily replace its pre-war carrier aircrews, while American training and production systems were already expanding. From this point onward, the Imperial Navy would not again bring both numerical strength and a full set of veteran carrier air groups to the same battle. For Rochefort, the result was mixed. Nimitz praised Hypo's contribution, but officers in Washington, who had disagreed with him, eventually succeeded in having him reassigned away from code-breaking work. Even with Midway behind him, Nimitz did not have an easy task. Japan still held a wide defensive perimeter, and its army remained dug in across large parts of China, Southeast Asia, and island chains deep into the Pacific. The United States Navy had won an important victory with 3 carriers and a calculated ambush, but it still did not have a complete plan for crossing the remaining ocean and closing on Japan. Nimitz began to build that plan on 2 main foundations: logistics and submarines. Pearl Harbor did not stay a graveyard. Salvage divers working in oil filled and twisted compartments refloated and repaired battleships that had seemed beyond recovery. West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania all returned to service after long reconstruction, and some of those ships that had been hit in 1941 later fired full broadsides in battles such as Surigao Strait. Behind them, another kind of fleet was developing. Oilers and supply ships turned the Central Pacific into what one historian has called a mobile base, because refueling and rearming ships at sea, rather than hauling them back to port, became routine practice. Nimitz later referred to this method of replenishment at sea as the United States Navy's secret weapon in the Pacific, because it allowed carrier groups to remain on station for long periods and keep up repeated strikes instead of having to withdraw to Hawaii after each operation. American submarines, the branch of the Navy that Nimitz knew best from his own career, now began a sustained campaign against Japanese shipping. By the end of the war, those submarines had sunk a large share of Japan's merchant fleet and a number of its major warships, and in later comments Nimitz said he believed submarines, rather than the atomic bomb, had been the decisive weapon against Japan's ability to continue the war. On land and at sea, his forces were moving away from constant crisis management towards steady offensive pressure. In August 1942, United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands and seized an unfinished Japanese airstrip that they renamed Henderson Field. For roughly 6 months, that airstrip and the narrow stretch of water beside the island became the focus of repeated battles. Japanese and American surface ships fought in severe night actions. At Savo Island and Tassafaronga, United States cruisers and destroyers were sunk in numbers that shocked commanders, mainly by Japanese torpedoes and gunnery. Transports were hit and burned, supplies ran low, and officers on the scene later recalled that at times it was not clear whether the United States would be able to hold the island. The Americans did not give it up. When the campaign seemed to have stalled, Nimitz replaced his South Pacific Area commander, Robert Gormley, with William Halsey, but he did not cancel the operation or remove every officer who had a bad night action, and biographers note that this approach mattered to the way his subordinates judged his leadership. Guadalcanal ended with the Japanese withdrawing their remaining troops in early 1943, and historians generally see that withdrawal as the point at which Japan lost the ability to launch major new offensives in the South Pacific. From there, Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor looked west and north. Rather than attack every Japanese strongpoint directly, his staff worked out what became known as island hopping. The idea was to bypass the most heavily fortified positions, cut their supply lines with submarines and aircraft, and move past them. Bases such as Rabaul were to be isolated while American forces took weaker positions that offered better anchorages and airfield sites, with each captured island becoming a staging point for the next step. The strategy was intended to save American lives compared with a direct assault on every major Japanese position, but it also left tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers stranded on bypassed islands, cut off with little prospect of relief, and gradually running out of food and medicine. In November 1943, that approach was tested at Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. The Japanese commander on Tarawa was later quoted as saying it would take 100 years to capture his atoll. In reality, United States Marines took the atoll in about 76 hours, at a very high cost, roughly 1,000 Americans killed and around 2,000 wounded, on a piece of coral less than 3 miles long. The battle exposed problems in planning, in understanding local tides, and in equipment, and it forced the Navy and the Marine Corps to refine the amphibious methods that would be used repeatedly as the advance continued through the Marshalls and into the Marianas. By the middle of 1944, the Central Pacific fighting had shifted to the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Taking those islands would give the United States airfields within range of Japan for new B-29 bombers. The Japanese Navy understood the implications, and it assembled most of its remaining carrier strength and a large part of its surface fleet for a battle it hoped would reverse American gains. The result, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, became known among American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Radar, improved fighter control, and well-trained carrier air groups inflicted very heavy losses on attacking Japanese aircraft, with hundreds of planes shot down for comparatively light American losses. The Japanese fleet itself avoided annihilation, but its carrier air arm was shattered. Some aviators and officers later argued that Spruance, who commanded the United States Fifth Fleet in that battle, should have chased more aggressively to sink additional Japanese ships. Nimitz did not share that criticism. He believed Spruance's first duty had been to protect the Saipan invasion force and judged that pressing the pursuit too far might have exposed the transports to danger, and he kept Spruance in important commands, supporting him in discussions in Washington in much the same way he supported other subordinates who came under fire. That habit mattered when operations went badly as well as when they went well. In late 1944 and again in 1945, Halsey's fast carrier forces ran into powerful typhoons that capsized several destroyers and left many other ships damaged or in some cases sunk. Courts of inquiry afterward criticized Halsey's handling of weather information, and some officers believed he should be taken out of high command. But although Nimitz accepted the findings on the need for better weather procedures, he chose not to end Halsey's career and kept him in senior posts. Biographers say that officers understood from this pattern that if they took calculated risks in battle, Nimitz would judge them on their overall record rather than on a single disaster. While the carrier war moved steadily toward Japan, another argument was playing out over overall strategy. The Pacific had been divided into two large commands. Nimitz controlled the Pacific Ocean areas and the Central Pacific push through the Gilbert, Marshall, and Mariana Islands toward Japan. General Douglas MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific area, leading a separate drive along New Guinea and back toward the Philippines. The arrangement reflected geography, but also personalities. MacArthur, a very senior army general and former field marshal in the Philippines, was widely seen as unlikely to accept a subordinate position under a Navy admiral. And historians generally agree that Roosevelt accepted divided commands rather than risk the political cost of forcing a single unified chain of command. By 1944, the two axes of advance came together around a central question: what to do next? Nimitz and Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, favored bypassing the Philippines and striking instead at Formosa, modern Taiwan, or nearby positions that would more directly cut Japan off from its southern sources of oil and other resources. MacArthur insisted that the United States had a moral duty to return to the Philippines and argued that once liberated, those islands would give bases and airfields that were just as effective for blocking Japanese shipping. Roosevelt ultimately chose to follow MacArthur's plan. His decision rested on military calculations and alliance politics, and later writers note that he was also aware of the promise MacArthur had made when he left Corregidor in 1942. For Nimitz, that choice meant changing his timetable and providing the major naval forces needed to support the return to the Philippines. In October 1944, those converging American forces met the Imperial Japanese Navy in what is commonly described as the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Fought over several days, and in several separate actions, Leyte Gulf saw Japanese surface forces try a complicated and very risky plan. One group of mostly empty carriers was sent north to draw William Halsey's Third Fleet away, while other forces came in from the west and south to attack the American invasion, shipping off Leyte. Among the resulting actions were the Battle of Surigao Strait, where older United States battleships, including several that had been sunk or badly damaged at Pearl Harbor, crossed in front of the Japanese Southern Force and used radar-directed gunfire to destroy it, and the Battle off Samar, where small United States escort carriers and their screening destroyers and destroyer escorts fought a running battle against a much stronger Japanese center force, and with the help of aircraft and confusion on the Japanese side, managed to turn it back. By the end of Leyte Gulf, Japan had lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 26 warships in all. The Imperial Navy still had ships on its lists, but as an offensive fleet, it was effectively finished. And from then on, Nimitz's carrier groups and submarines operated in the Western Pacific with far less opposition than before. The last year of the war pushed the Pacific Fleet into the most costly fighting it would face. In February 1945, Marines and Navy units assaulted Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island about 750 miles from Tokyo. Japanese defenders, dug into tunnels and caves under a carefully prepared system of positions, resisted to the end. The battle lasted 36 days. Nearly 6,800 Americans were killed and more than 19,000 wounded, and Japanese military deaths were in the tens of thousands, often estimated at close to 20,000. The raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi became famous, but the landscape of ash and ruins under it reminded planners that each move closer to Japan was exacting a high price. Okinawa, which the United States attacked in the spring of 1945, proved even more costly. The island, a few hundred miles from the Japanese home islands, became the site of the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Over nearly 3 months of fighting, American ground forces suffered roughly 50,000 casualties, including more than 12,000 dead. Japanese military deaths ran into the tens of thousands, and civilian losses were catastrophic, with local estimates eventually putting Okinawan deaths from bombardment, combat, starvation, and coerced suicides at well over 100,000. At sea, large-scale kamikaze attacks sank 36 Allied ships and damaged more than 360 others. The United States, with its larger industrial base, could absorb losses on that scale in a way Japan could not. But the cost forced American planners to think hard about what an invasion of the Japanese home islands, the projected Operation Downfall, might require. Some wartime estimates spoke of hundreds of thousands of American dead and wounded, and very large numbers of Japanese casualties if conventional assaults went ahead against Kyushu and Honshu. It was against that background that in February 1945, Nimitz was briefed in detail on a secret effort he had previously known only in outline, the Manhattan Project. Captain Frederick Ashworth, sent by General Leslie Groves, came to Guam to explain that an atomic bomb might be ready for use later that year. Ashworth later recalled that Nimitz reacted skeptically, asking in substance whether the people running the project understood that he was fighting a war in February while they were talking about something they hoped to have by August. The story fits with Nimitz's caution as a theater commander about promises for weapons that did not yet exist in operational form. After the war, he would say in public that, from a purely military standpoint, the atomic bomb had not played a decisive part in Japan's defeat, and he pointed instead to submarines and blockade as having already crippled Japan's ability to fight. But the wartime decision to use or not use the bomb was not his to make. That authority lay with President Harry Truman. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another B-29, Bockscar, bombed Nagasaki. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's intention to surrender. Plans for Operation Downfall were put aside. Debate would continue for decades over whether the bombs had been necessary, whether Japan was already close to collapse under blockade and conventional bombing, and what moral lines had been crossed. But for the sailors, soldiers, and Marines under Nimitz, the immediate fact was that the invasion of Japan they had been preparing for would not take place. On September 2nd, 1945, the Pacific War ended in Tokyo Bay. The battleship Missouri lay at anchor surrounded by United States and Allied ships. Among them was West Virginia, the battleship that had sunk in the mud at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and been laboriously refloated and rebuilt. On Missouri's deck, representatives of the Japanese government signed the Instrument of Surrender. General Douglas MacArthur signed as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. Nimitz, now a 5-star fleet admiral and commander-in-chief of the Pacific Ocean areas, signed for the United States. The ceremony was brief and formal. It closed a conflict that had begun for the United States with capsized battleships at Pearl Harbor and ended with a navy able to project power to Japan's own waters. Nimitz had commanded that navy for just under 4 years. In that stretch, he took a fleet that many contemporaries saw as crippled beyond repair, and, through a combination of industrial strength and a series of hard decisions, saw it become what many historians have called the most powerful maritime force up to that time. He did not do that alone. No commander does. But from Midway onward, his choices about whom to trust, when to take risks, and how to work within political limits shaped the course of the campaign. He accepted the judgments of his codebreakers at Hypo when others doubted them and committed his carriers on their reading of AF before Midway. He backed subordinates such as Raymond Spruance and William Halsey when critics wanted them removed, judging that aggressive commanders sometimes made mistakes and that fear of career-ending punishment for a single failure was unhealthy in wartime. He argued internally for a faster route toward Japan through places like Formosa, then carried out a different approach when Washington chose to support MacArthur's return to the Philippines. He pressed for better logistics and got a fleet that could refuel and rearm at sea far from any base. After the war, Nimitz became chief of naval operations and oversaw the demobilization of a navy that had expanded into a global force and then had to contract toward peacetime. He later held mainly ceremonial and diplomatic roles, including service for the United Nations, and spent his remaining years mostly out of the public eye, dividing his time between California and visits to his home state of Texas. He declined to write memoirs, saying he did not want his own account to minimize the roles of others. For historians, he left different kinds of evidence instead, among them his wartime diaries, his official reports, and a few public comments that reveal his priorities more clearly than any autobiography would have done. In one of those comments, looking back on the Pacific Campaign, he stated that the atomic bomb had played no decisive part, from a purely military standpoint, in Japan's defeat, and he again stressed the part played by submarines and logistics in cutting off an island empire's ability to sustain war. The story that had begun with a change of command on a submarine in a wrecked harbor ended with some of those same ships anchored in an enemy bay. West Virginia, once sunk in shallow water, now lay among the victors off Tokyo. Submarines that had slipped out under smoke in 1941 were by 1945 lined up in orderly rows. Carriers that had gone to sea as outnumbered raiders now dominated the horizon. Chester Nimitz did not create that transformation on his own, but from the day he arrived to take command at Pearl Harbor to the morning he signed his name on Missouri's deck, he carried the responsibility for guiding the Pacific Fleet from disaster toward victory, one intelligence gamble, one hard argument in Washington, and one costly island at a time.